So today is Monday, July 11th, 2011, and I am here with Joyce Bartels. And the first question I wanted to ask you was what you knew about the Mormons that lived here on the island. Like, have you found anything in the archives or anything that would indicate what their lives were like, or?
Well, they were mostly farmers, and after uh, Strang came with just a few other men in the fall of 1847, and there were several Gentile families living here on the island. The Mormons refer to anyone who is not Mormon as a Gentile. And there was a trading post at the north end of the island at Whiskey Point, run by Alva Cable, and some fishermen whose permanent homes were on Mackinac Island or St. Helena Island or St. Ignace. Very few homes, very little population in what is now Charlevoix. At that time it was called Pine River. Strang and the other men who were with him worked for the Gentiles who were here during that winter, cutting cordwood and doing the jobs that were needed to be done. And then the next spring, they left the island and started bringing other Mormon families here. And they began to come in some pretty good numbers. He had established a stake at Voorhees, Wisconsin, in the Burlington area. Joseph Smith had ordained him an elder and had sent him there to do that. So there were already some of Strang's followers in the Wisconsin area, and those people came to Beaver Island. At first, there was a lot of animosity between the two groups of people, and jealousy, especially when more and more of the Mormon families came to stay here. Strang began to feel more powerful as he had more and more of his followers here. And even though Brigham Young had excommunicated him at the time of Joseph Smith's death, Strang also excommunicated Brigham Young. And they and at least three other men were convinced that they were the follower, or should be the head of the Mormon Church, of the Joseph Smith's Mormon Church after his death. The Mormons also fished and cut the trees to sell cordwood to the boats on the lakes, and that was their main industry, their main source of income. Farming, of course, was for their own sustenance, and they had some animals. Everyone who came brought what he could with him. So there were farm animals. I think there were a few horses and a few oxen, not many. And also, there were many rumors about how the Mormons were pirates and preyed on the boats in the area. But there's no way of substantiating that. We only know what somebody wrote down back then. And although the majority of the Mormon people who were here were just common, ordinary, hard-working people who believed in what Strang taught, there were a few renegades, and they seemed to have Strang's ear. So there were some things that were done that were no doubt, some of the rumors were no doubt true. In 1850, the print shop was built, the building is now our museum, and they had a printing press, and they printed their their newspaper, the Northern Islander, which was first a weekly, and then it became a daily newspaper, and was the only daily newspaper in Grand Rapids, north of or in Michigan, north of Grand Rapids at that time. And there is a plaque on the rock outside the museum put there by the Newspaper Association back in the 1940s and 1950s to commemorate that. Um, Also, their religious tracts were printed there. And Strang became more and more powerful since there were more people here on the island to vote than in all the rest of the legislative district. Strang was elected to 2 terms of the Michigan legislature and served well. He had to go by way of Wisconsin to get to Detroit because of the threats from the people on Mackinac Island that if he came by there, he wouldn't get any farther. But while he was in the legislature, he introduced legislation to create a county called Manitou, which comprised all the islands in the Beaver Archipelago, the Beavers, the Foxes, and the Manitou, or the Manitou Islands. And that county was in existence until 1895, when it was dissolved by the Michigan legislature. And the Foxes and the Manitous went to Leelanau County, and the Beavers went to Charlevoix County. So many of the old records are filed under Manitou County, and there are some in the Michigan State Archives.
Do you know why they split up Manitou County?
Well, because the people who were running Manitou County were not doing it legally. And the county seat was St. James. So they had gotten themselves into a debt. There was a lawsuit against them which went to the Supreme Court. And Leelanau paid off that debt, but Charlevoix County didn't refuse to do it. So the Beaver Island people had to assess themselves taxes so they could pay off that debt, which was no more than right because they had run it up in the first place.
Mm.
But anyway, the Mormon group were highly religious. Strang was really dedicated to telling his followers how to run their lives. And he wrote the Book of the Law of the Lord with all his rules and regulations for how they should live. And they were mostly really generally good, like health things and that sort of thing. But one of the things, and this is fact and rumor, is that he devised a sort of a trouser uniform for the women to wear, and the women called it bloomers. And we know that it's practical to wear some pants nowadays, but back then the women didn't like it, and supposedly 2 of the men were whipped because their wives refused to wear those bloomers. But also there were other reasons for their being punished. That was the punishment, was to be so many lashes at the whipping post. Well, 2 of those men got really upset with all the regulations and the things that were going on, and it appears with some collusion with the United States government, plotted to get rid of Strang. And one time the USS Michigan had been sent here by the federal government, and the captain sent for Strang to come to see him on the boat. And as Strang stepped on the dock, the 2 men, Wentworth and Bedford, who had hidden themselves behind the barrels at McCullough's store, which was across from the dock, jumped out and they shot him several times, pistol whipped him, kicked him as he fell down, and then ran aboard the ship where they were taken hostage, or they were taken supposedly prisoner, and the ship weighed anchor and left for Mackinac City, where they were turned over to the sheriff. Strang did not die immediately, and his um, inner circle and one of his wives took him to Voorhees, Wisconsin, where his parents, to his parents' home. And he died there 17 days later, and he is buried there. The two men who had been taken to Mackinac City were held in jail just a few hours and then released and treated as heroes by the rest of the population there. And then those men and many others who had left the island because of Strang's policies armed themselves and came and literally drove the Mormons off the island. Just put them on whatever boat came in the harbor, and they went wherever that boat was going. So consequently, the colony was dispersed. A few of them did get back together in the Wisconsin area where they had started. A few of them settled in the Boyne City area in Michigan. And there are still several hundred of Strangite Mormons in the United States practicing Strang's teachings in Wisconsin and Missouri, and I don't believe there are any more in Michigan, but there are a few. And once in a while, some of them come here to visit. So anyway, is that what you wanted to know?
That's great. Yeah. So a little bit more about like the exile of the Mormons. Were they able to like take all their things with them?
What they could carry, just what they could carry,
Yeah.
and if there wasn't room on the boat, it was just left on the shore.
Okay.
There's a really good article written by his last name's Gordon, Jerry Gordon, who was a descendant of Warren Post, who was one of Strang's closest associates, telling how what had happened to his grandparent or great grandparents at the time. And they lived several miles out of town. Warren had gone with Strang to Wisconsin, so there was just his wife who was pregnant and the small children. And they put what they could in a wagon so that they could pull the wagon, and got to the shore and just were put on a boat. And it was a Warren Post eventually did rejoin them, but it was quite a while before he did. So, but, and it took several days for that to happen. But then they left food on the table. Some of them they left chickens in the chicken house. The crops were all planted. What few animals they had were left behind, and
and then so I was also wondering if you could talk about in the post-Mormon era, like the non-Irish groups that inhabited the island.
Well, the only non-Irish groups that I'm aware of were some Germans who came during the time of the priest who was after the Mormons left. There were Irishmen who were fishing in the Great Lakes and were aware of the group here on the island, and when they realized they were gone, like John Bonner, who was the first one, had a fishing camp on Gull Island, which is west of Beaver, and he was told that the Strang was killed and that his followers had left. He came over to the island and found the empty houses, and so he sent word to his family back in Toronto, where they were living. They had come to this country before the big potato famine and the big exodus, and were settled in Toronto, Canada. So his family came, and some of their friends, and more of their family, and settled here on the island in the harbor at first. And then they contacted more of their friends from Erinmore, who were established in New York City, and some who were established in Pennsylvania, where they were working in the mines. And they began to come gradually. And then in 1870, in the 1870s, when there was a good-sized population of Irish here, a priest was sent here, Father Malone. And he was here for a few years when Father Peter Gallagher, who was from Ireland, born in Ireland, but from the Boston area, no, not Boston, Philadelphia area, and who spoke Gaelic, was sent here by the diocese to be the priest. He was not very highly educated and supposedly couldn't even say a high mass, which was different than Father Malone. But the Irish really loved him because he was just one of the boys and he spoke Gaelic. Mm. Well, when he died in 1895, or 1898, the priest who was sent here was German, Father Zugelder. And because of him, some of the German families came who were farmers, the Rickskers, and, well, the Allers were not farmers, but they were German, and they came. And I can't think of any of the other names right now. But, and of course, they gradually began to intermarry with the Irish families who were here. And then, when the Beaver Island Lumber Company started operations here on the island, two Frenchmen, the Lafreniere brothers, and Marshall Griffin, who became the son-in-law of old Nelts Lafreniere, walked across the ice from Charlevoix looking for work with a lumber yard. They had been lumbering on the mainland and looking for work with the lumber company. And the two Lafreniere brothers stayed and married Irish women, and their descendants are still here. There weren't any other really groups of non-Irish. There were individuals who came and were here for a few years, and some who stayed, but not any. Those were the only really groups of non-Irish who came to the island.
And they were able,
to absorb, to be absorbed into the culture.
Okay. And they were mostly Catholic groups, right?
They were Catholic. The Germans were Catholic, and also the French. So the primary, there were a few Protestant families, but not many. And the island was primarily Catholic, and there was just the one church until probably the 1940s, when more tourists started coming to the island to build homes and stay. An Episcopal mission was established here, St. James Episcopal Mission. And then in the 1960s, when there were and when they found out that the Episcopal Mission was only going to be available to the Protestants during the summer when there was an Episcopal priest here, several families of Protestants who were living here banded together and formed the Beaver Island Christian Church, which was the third church. And now there is another fellowship which broke away from the Beaver Island Christian Church and formed the Lighthouse Fellowship. So there's really 4 established religious communities on the island now, the Catholics being the largest.
I see. Okay. Do you know, if there was intermarriage is between people of different, like the Protestants and the Catholics when they first came here? Or was it mostly
in fact, that's somebody, the Pishners, that's another family. The Allers were Protestant. The Pishners were Protestant, but they did intermarry with the Catholics and were mostly Protestant from then on. I mean, mostly Catholic from then on.
Okay.
Pishners were another family, but they were one of them had the sawmill, and Barry's father was the engineer on patrol boat number 1, which was a government boat which patrolled these waters to make sure the fishing laws were being followed.
Oh, yeah. I see. Would you mind talking a little bit about the sort of the boom in the fishing industry? Because I was wondering if it had any effect on like the social structure of the island.
Well, during the um, really about 1885, the fishing industry here was the fishing in this area was the best in any place in the whole United States, from what I've read. But there weren't that many people here at that time. It was after the lumber company came, and more people came because of that, that the social structure really began to take effect. They formed the different groups. They had a hive of Maccabees here. They had Oddfellows. They had Hibernians, which was an Irish organization, and of course the um, different societies of the church held social functions. The house that's next to the museum belonged to the Cundy Gallagher, and the upstairs was used as a social hall, dance floor, and a gathering place. They referred to it as Gallagher Hall before the parish hall was ever built. So there were things going on before then, and the parish hall was built during the time Father Zugelder was here. But in the old newspaper articles, it tells about uh, different people who had entertained, and the number of people they entertained and what they served, and this sort of thing. And there was dancing and music, always dancing and music. The Irish have an innate musical ability, a talent. Many of them have not had any musical training at all, but they're able to sing and play instruments, and of course they all danced. Really, anytime they got together, they danced. But the biggest, the largest population was during the time the lumber company was in operation here. And of course, the men who weren't actively involved in fishing worked for the lumber company, the Irish, and I imagine some of the Germans also. But then they just, and then in the 1870s and 1880s, the state of Michigan started supporting the fishing industry. They built fish hatcheries and they planted fish. They also hired the island fishermen and some of the mainland fishermen to remove the eggs from the female fish during the spawning season, and those they raised in the fish hatcheries. So the fishing industry was actively supported by the state of Michigan from that time on. And of course, I don't remember exactly when they stopped planting the fish and stopped operating the fishing hatcheries. But fishing had gradually begun to decline, and then when the St. Lawrence Seaway was opened, and I don't remember when that was, and the lamprey eel was able to come in and into the Great Lakes, and that really decimated the fishing industry. So by 1955, 1960, there was very little fishing done here. So the people who had been fishing left the island to find some other work, and some of them became ship captains on the Great Lakes. Ray Cull, for instance, had been fishing here. Many of them went to Chicago, where there were already family members living, and found work. And um, one of the women told me that they just knew as soon as they graduated from high school they had to leave. They had to go someplace to find work. So they went to, now Catherine Riskers went to Pontiac, where there were family. Grand Rapids, the Chicago, a lot of people went to Chicago. Some of the islanders had settled in Escanaba earlier. Some had gone to Wisconsin. But the ones who stayed here were just did everything they could. The WPA was active here on the island during the Depression, and there was government help.
Right. They would build roads and stuff like that.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. In fact, we've got a few pictures, just a few pictures in the museum of some of those activities, working with the horses and wagons, and they built the sidewalks and things like that. But then the state of Michigan then introduced salmon into the Great Lakes because of then the alewives came in and just really they died and they were all over the beaches and just really nasty. So they introduced salmon and to clean up the alewives, which happened. And then the whitefish and the trout began to rejuvenate. And there were some active commercial fishing going on during those years, in the 60s and the 70s, into the 80s. And then a federal judge ruled that because of the treaty of a treaty of sometime in the 1870s, only Native American fishermen could fish commercially in this area of the Great Lakes. So the state bought out the non-Native American fishermen, and only Native Americans fish now.
Okay. That's interesting. Did you know that if when the Irish first came and started fishing, did the Native Americans, like, what kind of relationship did they have with them? Did they help them out in the fishing?
The early ones who were here before the Mormons came really treated the Native Americans very badly. That's where Whiskey Point got its name, because they mixed up a ersatz whiskey with water and a little whiskey and black pepper and tobacco to make it sort of taste like whiskey, which they traded to the Indians for for their work or their furs or that sort of thing. Strang was very kind to the Indians. He stopped the sale of whiskey. Of course, the Mormons were teetotalers. He set up schools for the Native Americans. Father Barriga had landed on the island in 1832, established a mission, and baptized and converted some Indians at that time. And some stayed with Catholic religion, some didn't. But most of the Native Americans were baptized into the Catholic Church. I really don't have any records of any way that the Native Americans were treated in general. I have some word of mouth from people who I've talked to in the recent years, how they were treated, and it wasn't very nice. Most of them were just very poorly treated. But many families lived here. When the state bought there were many Native Americans living on the other islands. But then the state bought those islands. No, they were privately owned. The House of David owned most of High Island at one time. And then individuals bought those islands. And then the state bought them from those individuals, but not until the 1950s, 1940s, 1950s. But I think probably the Native Americans left High Island mostly during the time the House of David was there and came to live on Beaver. And there were many Indian families living here on Beaver during the 1930s, 1940s.
Do you know if like maybe later in the early 20th, later 20th century, like I know there are still Native American families here. I'm sure the relations have gotten a lot better.
Well, yes, in some now especially. There were times when it wasn't very, very good, and of course the Native Americans were mostly pretty interested in alcohol.
Okay.
Archie Lapinier had a special room with an outside exit, an entrance for the Native Americans. They weren't allowed into the Shamrock as in general. But and there were some really bad things that happened with the young girls. But now there certainly isn't any overt discrimination in any way. It's like any place else. There's always undercover kind of things. But there are three parts of three families still living here on the island. Well, counting Skip, there are four. Skip Duhamel, who's fishing, the Madres, and the Naponts, and the Kenwabakisses. And of course, family members visit over the years. George Anthony, who wrote the book The Elders Speak, is married to one of the Kenwabakisse girls, and his family was from Garden Island, the Anthonys.
Where was he from originally?
Garden Island.
I mean, what's his ethnicity?
Well, they're Chippewa and Odawa.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, going back to sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, in light of the fishing industry and everything was coming underway. I was wondering if any sort of class divisions ever occurred on the island?
Yes, you're right. Yes, and I don't believe many of the people who worked for the lumber company really were absorbed into the social. At least the reports in the newspaper the names were mostly Irish when they entertained and that sort of thing. So I think probably the majority of the people who came here to work for the lumber company didn't really, unless they would happen to marry one of the islanders, and that happened. But then most of them left after the lumber company was through. There was a distinction between the people in the country and the people in town for even into the 1930s and 1940s. The people I knew who grew up during that time said they didn't even know the people who lived out in the country unless they came into high school, because hardly anybody had an automobile, and it wasn't easy to get around on the island. There were several automobiles here in the early 1900s. In fact, in the 100 Years Ago column, where hearing about people getting automobiles. In fact, in this July issue tells about, or yeah, the July issue tells about the captain of the ferry boat bringing his automobile over and driving around the road. So it was the first automobile on Beaver Island.
Do you know what kind that was?
It didn't say.
Didn't say.
It might have said earlier what kind he bought, but I don't remember it. I didn't put it in my memory bank.
Right, yeah.
I also I don't have a lot of my only information from that time is what I've read in the newspaper articles, or what I've read from the articles that Mrs. Toller wrote and Paul Connor. And Paul Connor got his information from newspaper articles, but and Mrs. Collar got hers from the older Irish people who she knew as a child. But she came in 1915, so it was just their memories from that time. But and now, of course, there's the hayseeders and the fish chokers on St. Patrick's Day.
Right.
And they have the tug of war, and the fish chokers always win. For some reason.
Is there any reason? Or
well, there's more.
There's more.
More people living in town than out in the country, but I really don't know. One time, my son-in-law tied the end of the rope to the bumper of a truck, and they still lost.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
But it's all in good fun.
Right. It's more of a friendly
right.
rivalry.
Well, but I've heard stories of people's barns being burned and things like that when there was some feud type of thing going on. So,
wow.
and probably the Islanders wouldn't like to hear this, but
it happens.
Well, it does happen.
One thing we're interested in as archaeologists is the development of the homesteads and the buildings themselves. Like, we know that once the Mormons were evicted, that the Irish came in and just took some of the houses.
Yeah, just moved in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Were the majority of the houses on the coast, like on the shore? Or
not the Mormon houses. There were quite a few of those out in the country because they were farming. They had cleared the land. In fact, there were people living down at the south end of the island in a third township called Galilee. There were houses here in the harbor because of the business end of the fishing industry and the cordwood industry. And of course, the museum was built by the Mormons, and we're pretty sure that the next two houses, the Cull House and the Gillespie House, started out, the main part, as Mormon buildings. And the early house could very well be. There was one little cabin on Barney's Lake Road that has since fallen down that was a Mormon house. Jerry Corbett lived there. It was just a small cabin. Most of the homes that we see that are still standing in any form were built by the Irish after they came.
Do you know if like when the Irish came here, and did they keep sort of the general structure of the Mormon houses? Did they work off of that?
I think so. That in the beginning, anyway.
Okay.
And then built some additions. Now, Dr. Protar's home was the logs supposedly were there somewhere or available, that the Mormons had gotten them all ready before they left. And the Conley family used them to build their home. Whether there was also a summer kitchen type of thing and a woodshed on the back of Protar's home. And whether the Conleys built that or whether he had it built after he moved in, I don't know, as anybody really knows. But that was still standing when I first came to the island. It's since fallen down. there was a log house and a log barn across the road. The Bonners had a log house and a log barn before they built the house that's still there, the modern house. But those have since fallen down too. Tights Hill, where that barn structure is still standing, there was a house there. And there's still a log barn on the west side of the island where um, Barrett's now live, or Barrett's daughter. His name doesn't come to me. But that was a Gallagher home. But whether it was built by the Mormons, nobody knows. The only one we're sure is the print shop, the museum. The others could very well be, but there's no way to authenticate that. We have some archaeological reports in the files. I don't know if Bill's ever mentioned those to you. We had several archaeologists have been on the island. And have you read James Fitting's article in Volume 1?
I think so,
Yeah,
yes.
that's probably why Dr. Rotman wanted that.
Yeah.
But in, I don't know, 1940 somewhere, sometime not too long ago, there was an archaeologist here and did some digs on several properties, and we have those reports in the museum. Dr. Dietrich from CMU did a geological, well, that's geological, that's not archaeological, a geological tour of the island. But we haven't had a lot of, CMU hasn't done a lot of archaeology research over the years.
More biology.
Right,
yeah.
And geology.
Okay, well, I remember one time you gave me a really great overview of like the more prominent families over the history of Beaver Island and like sort of how they rose to power and stuff like that. Would you be willing to debrief us on that?
Okay.
Give us a sense.
Well, of course, Bowery Gallagher, William James Gallagher, was the really prominent person from the late 1900s into the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And also, I think it was his brother, Neil Gallagher, was the prominent fisherman. But had huge lifts of fish. But when the state instituted closed season law and law that determined the size of the nets they could use, in fact, he sued the state and went, I think, almost to the Supreme Court, if not to the Supreme Court, over this decision. But he lost, so he left and went to Escanaba, where he established his whatever he was doing up there. But he had a great influence on Island during that time. But Bowery stayed here, and he was the township supervisor for many, many years, St. James Township supervisor. There was also a Gallagher family, the Tite Gallagher family, who were supervisors in Pean Township for quite a few years, but they were farmers. They weren't as prosperous. They didn't have the financial means that Bowery apparently had. He also...
why they were called the Tite Gallaghers?
Well, the story that I heard was because when he first came to the island, he was wearing the fashionable peg leg pants. They were tight on his ankles. That's the story I heard. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. Salty supposedly had been an ocean seaman, a saltwater seaman, before he came to the island, the original Salty Gallagher. Harlem Gallagher came from Harlem, New York. And let's see, what were some of the other guys? Well, anyway, back to the prominent families. And then James McCann came from Mackinac Island and took over. There was a man named James Dormer who was from Buffalo, New York, who bought all the property up at Whiskey Point in the 1870s and established. Um, he had a trading post there, or he had a store, and he built some cabins and rented those out. And he also had fishermen who were fishing for his company, and had the idea to build a hotel and have that be a sort of a tourist resort. He lived here for a short time, overseeing the business, but decided that his wife didn't like it here, and he didn't like being so far from the rest of his business. So he had a manager, and Bowery Gallagher was his manager. And we have some letters that Bowery wrote to James Dormer during that time, telling him about so-and-so hadn't paid his rent and different things like that. But after he died, James McCann came and and then a man named John Day came to the island and was buying the store from James Dormer when he decided to build one here in the center part of town, in the harbor area, right where the community center is now. And so James McCann took over the one out at Whiskey Point. And he was a fisherman also. But his enterprise began to grow. James Dunleavy came from Chicago and built a building that's now the my head, the other bar.
The Beachcomber?
Beachcomber. And Dunleavy store. Yeah. And so there was enough business for 2 stores because of all the people here with the lumber company and everything. Because the population was probably 1,800 to 2,000 people at that time. It's been estimated. Well, we have the census, so we could count them up. But and the school had a lot of students. We have pictures of some of the school groups, and they're quite numerous. But then the lumber company went out of business or closed the mill in 1914. And it's my guess that most of the people who were working for the lumber company left at that time, because there wasn't any pension plans or anything like that back then. If you weren't working, you weren't getting paid. And so the population began to decrease. James Dunleavy died, and his building just stood empty for quite a while. And then James McCann's store was prosperous. The company store down where McDonough's is now was purchased by John Grill, who had been working in the store for the lumber company, and he operated that until he sold it to McDonough's in the 1930s. So there were 2 stores all that time, and there were several taverns around. Where the post office is now was a tavern at one time. There was one down in the area where the parish hall is at one time that Willie Boyle had. But the Shamrock wasn't built until Nels Lafreniere built it in about the 1920s, I believe. And it was on the other side of the road, and it was called the Village Inn. Now, whether it had a bar, I don't know, but it was a restaurant. um, the King Strang had served meals until, well, Ray Gilden was still serving meals there. So there was this King Strang restaurant, but the economy was gradually decreasing after the lumber company was gone and the fishing began to die off. So Willie, after Bowery died, then it was the McCanns, and then Nels Lafnir, who would come to work for the lumber company, married Sophia Boyle, who already had a store where the hardware store, the gift shop of the hardware store now was.
She ran that?
Yes,
Okay.
her brother or her uncle set her up. I just can't, well, that's in Paul Connors. Set her up in this store, and then after she married Nels, then it was expanded, and Nels began to buy more property and expand his. Well, Alvin told you about that. I overheard. And then when McDonough's, and then John Grill sold the store to McDonough's, and then the McDonough's began to prosper. And have I left anybody out? Cans, Dunleavy's, Gallagher's. But then when Bowery's sons, many of them left the island. They fished as long as they could. James H. Gallagher was township supervisor for quite a few years also, and he fished. James W. Gallagher, I don't believe was ever supervisor, but he did. He had a farm, and well, he farmed, and he delivered ice during the Depression. Janet O'Donnell was his daughter, and she told me about delivering ice. Worked for the WPA, anything that could be done, and then he ended up being manager of the boat company on the other side. So the Gallagher family sort of died out as far as prominence in political affairs and things. And the Dunleavys were gone. They didn't even, any of them, stay here on the island after James died and was no longer running the store. So, but the McCanns stayed, and John Runberg's grandfather fished, and his brother Michael ran the store. But then during the Depression, that was real. And then Nels Lafner bought the store. Oh.
And then the Gillespies came.
The Gillespies were not until the Gillespies were always here, and Jewel's father was a cook, and he sailed on some of the ships on the Great Lakes, but never any political involvement.
Okay.
Until Jewel came along, and then he began to be more involved politically and economically.
He set up
the telephone company.
Yeah,
right.
Okay, right.
Well, it was kind of an outreach from the Civic Association, but he was part of that, and he investigated and found out and found the company that was willing to come here. And then he ran the power plant also after that was built. He was more mechanically minded than any of the other islanders. I don't think he ever fished, but maybe he did. I don't know.
So would you say, like, sort of rise in prominence of the families maybe correlated with, like, the economic needs of the island, or? the
Yeah.
general trend
Mhm.
for that. Interesting.
Mhm.
Makes sense.
But Bowery Gallagher was able to buy a lot of property on tax sale. So he owned a lot of property on the island. And then during the Depression, outsiders began to buy property from tax sales. And that's how the Henry Allen accumulated all of the Donegal Bay area, Port St. James, and Trout Island. Henry owned Trout Island. Warren Townsend, who was an outsider, owned High Island, or at least part of it. Some non-Native Americans owned parts of Garden Island, and I believe there's still some small parcels that are owned by private owners. The state owns the rest.
Okay.
But, and of course, owning property, then they're able to sell it and prosper that way.
I see. That's great. Another question I had was considering sort of the relative isolation of the island from, the mainland. I was wondering how things like movements like prohibition or like even way later on the like women's movement, civil rights movement, like how did that play out on the island? Like,
Well, prohibition it was enforced here, but there were many ways. There were many people who were bootlegging liquor, and even a man who was from Chicago, who came here and bought property and married an island girl, was a bootlegger. I've been told. Believe it or not, back in was it the early 1900s or was it before? When in the early 1900s, because it's been in the 100 Years Ago column, there was a movement across the state of Michigan, maybe across the whole country. I haven't done any research into that, for prohibition. And they enacted something called local option, where the local governmental group, or the townships or the cities or the counties could vote whether they wanted to have liquor or not. And Beaver Island went dry, if you can imagine it, with all these Irish here. They voted to, and consequently there were arrests for not observing the laws and that sort of thing over the years. But it's coming back into the news in the 100 Years Ago columns, because other parts of the state are beginning to rethink this and voting again. Now, whether it was something that had to be voted on regularly, I don't know. I haven't gone into it that much. I've just got what I read in the newspaper. But I couldn't believe it when Beaver Island voted dry.
Wow, that's hard to believe.
I don't think there's been any general women's movements here on the island. The women have always run things. It was the women who kept things going, and whether the men believed it or not, Irish mothers doted on their sons. They could do no wrong in any way, no matter how bad drunks or anything. They were nothing. They never were doing anything wrong as far as the mothers were concerned. And the wives were the same way. They just put up with what they did. I don't know if it's that way much anymore, but it might be to a certain extent. But and of course the nuns ran the school.
So were there a lot of women who ran businesses, like?
Well, Sophia Boyle. Also, there was let's see, who was that? Some relative of Manus Bonner. I think she was a McCafferty, had a little store down on the harbor where Ray Matella lives now, back during the time the Beaver Hotel first opened. My neighbor told me about Mamie O'Donnell, who had a little store around where the area where the Beaver Gems T-shirt shop, along in there somewhere. The superintendent of schools was a woman back in 100 years ago, May Stewart of the county, and she came here and to oversee the schools, check on the schools. When the beach, James McCann turned the building that had been the Dunleavy store into the Beachcomber, and after he died, his wife ran it. She was still running it when I first came to the island. And there have been many women who tended bar here and worked in the restaurants. Eva McDonough worked in the grocery store right along with Lloyd. Skip works there now, and so does Lynn Ann.
So they've all been always been pretty industrious.
Right. Right.
That's great.
But as far as any real general movement, I don't think there's. Certainly not by the Irish.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the outsiders probably have instigated things at times, but.
Yeah. Interesting. So, in terms of your own personal experience on the island, when did you first start coming in?
1960.
1960. Okay. Do you want to?
Well, since you first came in 1960, what would you say is the largest social change or just the largest change to the island community?
Well, the tourist business.
Yeah.
Tourism had barely started. There were, the Allen family had built some cabins out on Donegal Bay that they rented. They had a few cabins down here on the shore that they rented. Carl Felix had built the rustic villa cabins in the 1950s. And Walt Wojan had built Harbor View Motel down on the shore. I don't think Harbor View up on in the harbor was built when I first came, but it was soon after. I can't remember for sure. I don't have any real memory of that. So the tourist business had started, and of course during the time the Beaver Hotel was open, people came from all over to spend time here on the island at the hotel. They came from Rock Island, Illinois. Friends of Dr. Protar's came to stay for a month or maybe all summer, and then some of them bought property and built houses here, summer houses. Dr. Ruth built a summer cabin right down where Harbor View is now, and Miss Griselli built the house that's on the way out of town where the stone pillars are. That was her summer home. On the back beach, there were quite a few. The Helen Collar's family had built a place, and several other families. Mrs. Heflin's family had built a place up there. So there was some tourism. There were some summer visitors for many, many years. Judge, that name's gone. He was from Pontiac, Royal Oak area. Came and bought property, and he started a laundromat here on the island, or a laundry. It wasn't a laundromat; it was a laundry. It was called the Teepee Wash'em, and that was operating when I first came to the island. There were some little gift shops that summer people had started. There was one called the Pink Poodle in what's now the hardware store gift shop, but it was only open in the summer. And Dick Lafner's wife had a gift shop in the building that was called the Shillelagh. That's gone, long gone now. As it was built as a restaurant, an ice cream parlor. But and then when Henry Allen sold all his property to the American Central Land Development Corporation, and they came and cut all the roads through out there in Port St. James and subdivided it all into 60-foot wide lots. And they brought in high-pressure salesmen, and they flew people to the island to show them property, and they had dinners down in Lansing and different places where they invite people to come to dinner, and they sell the property, and they sold all the lots. But very little building was done out there until, I would say, in the 1980s, probably. It's when building began. Now, whether that was a result of the general economics of the country, it could very well have been. Before that, maybe not many people were able to afford to build a second home. There were a few contractors here on the island when I first came. But then some of the island young people began to. Ronnie Wojan went into contracting. And his dad, Walt Wojan, was a contractor. And some others came and went. But that was really when it started. The Beaver Islander was built and went into service in 1962. And that was quite a bit bigger than the first Emerald Isle. And the first Emerald Isle was the first boat that was built specifically for this run. Every other ferry had been adapted from some other use.
Okay.
So.
Sort of to finish up, do you have any of your fondest memories of when you first started coming, or any good stories?
Well, I suppose they all revolve around my good friends, Phil and Lily and Greg. And, well, we camped when we first came, and we had some pleasant times with camping when the kids were little. And for a long time, we would come for New Year's, be here for New Year's Eve, and we, together with the Greggs, had an open house, a big party at Greg's, and that was always fun. Everybody came. Oh, and then the first of the Close the Center parties, which just started because Matt Hahn, who was the director, wanted to use up the food that was left in the freezer when they closed down for the winter. The buildings were not winterized, so they just closed it down for the winter, drained everything and closed it down. So they decided to have a party, and they cooked what was left in the freezers, and island people brought a dish to pass and just had a real nice time. Well, then it got so popular that the administration started coming for the Close the Center party, and it changed completely. So I haven't been in many years. Of course, I have not been here at that time. I was always around Halloween. And then the Christian church puts on a big Thanksgiving dinner, and everybody's welcome to come. Deer hunters, anybody who wants to come. They cook the turkeys, and everybody brings a dish to pass. I've never been here for Christmas, but there are really, and especially in recent years, there are many, many things going on at that time with the Christmas cantata and the Santa Claus coming to visit and that sort of thing.
What was coming for New Year's like in the winter?
Well, for many years, the ferry made at least one trip after Christmas, and we often were on that trip. And once in a while, and it would be like the 26th or the 27th of December. And at least one time, in fact, I have a slide in my my slide program where the front of the ferry is just covered with ice, and they had to break ice to get into the harbor. But often it was wide open too. But they haven't done that for a long time now. The ferry stops fairly early in December, and I think that's because of the insurance. But we were here one time for New Year's, and Charlevoix got 19 inches of snow, and the island didn't get a bit. But we had to stay 3 days longer till they got the airport cleaned out. And then when we got there, we had to shovel our cars out of the snowdrifts. But and of course through the Greggs, I began to meet people and got to know more people. I guess I don't have any really most important things, but just a lot of fun things.
Enjoyed your time here. That's
right.
Great.
But I've always said, and you probably have learned, that Beaver Island is a place you're either crazy about or you can't stand. There's no in between at all.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your
Well,
time.
you're welcome.
It's been amazing.
Oh,
Thanks
well,
so much, Joyce.
You're welcome. I hope I was able to do what you wanted.
It was very helpful.